Good evening, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you once again to our 2006 Provincial Lecture Series, and our speaker tonight, Dr. Margaret Mohrmann. The headlines continue with the buzz of physician-assisted suicide. Our timing has been wonderful with this conference, and we've enjoyed a number of different perspectives. Take just a second tonight and look ahead in your program. Next week, Dr. Cromwell Crawford will be presenting to us on the topic from a Hindu perspective. And one of the unique things about Dr. Crawford is the fact that if you were to look online for anything published about bioethics from a Hindu perspective, you would come up with his name. There is just not a lot of stuff published focused that specifically on Hindu perspectives in bioethics. Another thing I'd like to draw your attention to in the program is the back of the program. I'd love for you to give us your name and address so that we might be able to send you an update. This is the journal that we publish in our Center for Christian Bioethics, and we'd love to be able to share with you a number of articles and news about the center and how we're doing there and the things we're involved in. So if you wouldn't mind putting your name and address there for us, we'd be happy to include you in our mailing list. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Mohrmann, graduated from the College of Charleston in 1969 with her undergraduate degree, went to the Medical University of South Carolina, graduating from there with her MD degree in 1973. She did a residency in pediatrics at Johns Hopkins Hospitals and then returned to the Medical University of South Carolina for a while. In 1987, she went to the University of Virginia as a doctoral student in religious ethics, taking a PhD then in religious ethics. She also was a part-time teacher and practitioner of primary care pediatrics there in Virginia at the Medical Center at the University of Virginia. She finished up with her PhD in 1995, and one of the things that was a delight for me is that she helped serve on my dissertation committee for my PhD at the University of Virginia, and had a great deal of influence on the way my work came out with the dissertation for my program. It was a delight to be able to work with her in that project. She holds joint appointments right now at the University of Virginia in the School of Medicine, program of Humanities in Medicine, and at the College of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Religious Studies. In the School of Medicine, she's an affiliated faculty member of the Center for Biomedical Ethics. She's the director of the Spirituality and Medicine curriculum, among other things. She does a lot there for them. And she also teaches in the Department of Religious Studies an undergraduate bioethics internship seminar, and teaches a number of other courses there for the Department of Religious Studies. Really, her interest in the intersection of ethics and religion or spirituality and medicine, how those three come together, has been the uniqueness of her work, and it is the uniqueness of Loma Linda as well. And this is her fourth time here with us, so we have enjoyed her interaction in the past, in part because of what she has written about this intersection. One of her most important books early on, 10 years ago, Medicine as Ministry, Reflections on Suffering, Ethics, and Hope. And I know some of my colleagues have used another of her books in a course that we teach on campus here, Theology of Human Suffering. This is the course we teach here, and her book entitled Pain Seeking Understanding has been used in our coursework here. Her most recent book, published in 2005, is called Attending Children, A Doctor's Education, where she tries to focus on that intersection of ethics and religion or spirituality and medicine. So she is uniquely situated to address our issues today, and so I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Margaret Mohrmann to our pulpit.
Thank you so much, Mark. Glad to have my bottle of water. I've just finished with about a month's worth of laryngitis, and I have a voice back, but I have no idea how long it'll last, so we'll see what happens. The water will help. It's really very good to be back here for, my fourth time. It's great. And to be speaking again under the esteemed name of Jack Proventia, to be working again with Mark Carr. I have such lovely memories of all the times that I have been privileged to be here. Memories not only of the kindnesses shown, but also of the really engaging intellectual atmosphere here. That comes out, I think, in the real commitment here to negotiating that narrow ridge that runs between belief and practice and social realities, runs between them and holds them together. So it's a great pleasure to be back. Seeing that the title for my talk commits me to speaking with you about the meanings of suicide, I will tell you that this is not going to be an excursion into statistics about suicide. It's also really not going to be an excursion into the ethical arguments that are usually rehearsed in the debate about physician-assisted suicide. I want to do something different. And the word in my title is meanings, plural, so that I'm not going to be giving you a single right answer to the question that I pose in the title. Instead, this is going to be, although necessarily brief, I hope relatively well organized, tour of Western thought about suicide, drawing from a variety of records in the fields of history and theology and literature. I told Mark earlier tonight this is sort of a self-indulgent lecture. What we're going to be doing is, what you're going to be doing is going with me through some of my favorite sites. Much of what I teach in religious studies has to do with the history of Christian ethics. History is one of my favorite topics. Part of what we're going to be doing today is going through some of the history of this idea. And I'm hoping that by doing this, that I will be offering some illumination for our current dilemmas about suicide and about physician-assisted suicide in particular, that maybe I'll be able to clarify some of what goes on in the arguments about that by viewing it from the perspective of the millennia of human thought about this human phenomenon. I can also say that the eclectic nature of this survey probably reflects my multiple personal intellectual viewpoints that I bring to the subject. To begin with, as a pediatrician, I watched suicide climb almost to the top of the list of causes of death in adolescence, and like my colleagues, puzzled over and grieved and felt helpless in the face of the phenomenon of teenagers killing themselves. But then, as an ethicist, I also have been struck by the variety of reactions, not so much to teen suicide, more particularly to physician-assisted suicide, reactions expressed by doctors and politicians and religious spokespersons, columnists, you name it, but reactions that seem to reflect a polarity of opinion about what suicide is or means. It's a polarization that certainly bears some resemblance to the encampments in the abortion debate, but I don't think is best read along precisely those same lines, as I think will become evident as I talk. And as a student of history, I have pondered the assumptions that are often made about the acceptance, perhaps even the encouragement of suicide among educated men in early Greek and Roman societies. And as a student of religion, I found myself skeptical about the familiar claim that the primary difference between ancient Rome and present-day America, at least in regard to suicide, is Christianity. So given that introduction, I could go off in any number of directions toward focusing on the meanings of suicide, starting, of course, with the basic question, meaning for whom? For the people most directly affected, the person who commits suicide, his family and friends, his community. For those who may be more professionally engaged in this, physicians and psychologists and clergy and counselors, or meaning for those who may consider suicide more in the abstract, which is what ethicists and philosophers do, and some theologians. But in general, it does seem to me that we probably cannot ultimately get at the meaning of suicide for the person who has committed that act. That even the person who leaves an explanatory note, I mean, even somebody like Seneca, whom I'm going to talk about in a minute, who left copious writings behind, illuminating his views on suicide, may give us only glimpses into what the act meant for that particular person when it was done. And of course, there have to be significant distinctions in meaning among all the various acts that can qualify as suicide. We'd be foolish to imagine some generic meaning that could apply to the very different acts of suicide committed by a teenager who hangs himself in the basement of his house late one night, or by a spy who chomps down on that cyanide capsule at the moment of capture, or by a businessman who's reacting to the shame of a corporate failure, or by a person who is already slowly dying of an intractably painful disease. So we can perhaps agree that there cannot be a single meaning, or even one set of meanings applicable to all who kill themselves. But nevertheless, I think that an exploration of this matter of meaning may at least help us understand better the kinds of moral judgments that we make or hear others make about those who contemplate or accomplish or assist suicide. So, to begin, I'm going to start with lines that were written in 1885 by Gerard Manley Hopkins, one of my favorite poets, English priest and poet. Hopkins had been sent in the year or two before that by his Jesuit order to be the professor of Greek at their school in Dublin. And the combination of being exiled from England, which is what he said he felt like, and of having to teach when he most felt like writing poetry, sent him into a tailspin of despair. And out of that desolation came a cluster of remarkable poems in which he wrestles with God and contemplates the possibility of self-destruction. And in the poem from which I've taken the lines that I'm going to read to you, what Hopkins is doing is talking himself out of committing suicide. And in doing so, he tells us pretty clearly what he thinks suicide means. So let me read you a few of these lines. I'll not carry in comfort despair, not feast on thee, not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of man in me, or most weary cry, I can no more. I can something, hope, wish day come, not choose not to be. It's in that last phrase, not choose not to be, that Hopkins implies that to commit suicide is to choose not to be. And what I want to think about with you as a way of clarifying our moral judgments is first, whether suicide is a choice and what that construal would entail. And second, whether what the person who commits suicide is choosing is in fact the condition of not being. Thank you for your patience with punctuation. One of the commonplaces of popular history is that suicide was common and casually accepted, even encouraged, in ancient Western societies, and that situation changed rapidly and drastically, for good or for ill, depending on where you stand, with the advent of Christianity. But it seems instead to be the fact that ancient attitudes towards suicide were both more complicated and more reserved than that, and that Christianity, at least during its first few centuries, was more ambivalent about suicide than might be evident from the later record. Now, I have to say that as we begin digging into the historical record, it is important to make the point that most of what we know about these people of 2,000 to 3,000 years ago comes from the educated men who wrote works that have survived. That means that we can say little about whether their philosophical attitudes towards suicide or the apparent frequency of the practice among them tells us anything about working or indigent men, or about women, slaves, children, who are all effectively voiceless and invisible to us. And along those same lines, you may have already noticed, but you certainly will notice as I go along, that I'm using the masculine pronoun in this talk. It's not because I eschew inclusive language, far from it. It's because The historical material is concerned almost entirely with men, and also because teen suicide, the problem that first concerned me as a pediatrician, is more common by a factor of 5 or 6 among young men than among young women. On the other hand, it would take another quite different talk, maybe I'll come back for my 5th one for that one again, a quite different talk to reflect on the equally troubling observation that by far most of the persons assisted in committing suicide by Dr. Kevorkian were women, as are most of the people who inquire about or request physician-assisted suicide. Another talk for another day. That said, the standard place to begin any discussion of ancient thought about suicide is with Plato's account of Socrates' death. You will recall, I'm sure, that Socrates killed himself because Athens ordered him to do so after having convicted him of corrupting the youth of the city. And before drinking the hemlock, Socrates talks with his friends about whether suicide can be a legitimate act, whether there may be some people for whom death is better than life, and whether it would therefore be right, morally right, for those people to break themselves. And Socrates' answer is that such an argument would be very reasonable were it not for the fact that we are the possessions of the gods. We've been placed in this life by the gods, much in the way that a commander would place a soldier at a guard post, and we don't have the freedom to abandon our post, to destroy our lives, unless, here's the important point, unless God sends some command, like the one that Socrates was himself facing in the form of the state's order to kill himself. Now, this argument that suicide is permissible if and only if it is compelled by the gods became the focal point of much of the ancient discussion of suicide. And the question, of course, revolves around how you might know that the gods have ordered you to die. There is another, less well-known, but perhaps, at least at the time, no less influential ancient example in the suicide of Zeno, who was the founder of Stoicism. This became the primary model for the early Stoic idea of what constitutes reasonable and permissible suicide. Zeno, at the age of 72, was leaving a hall where he had been lecturing when he slipped and fell and broke his finger. It may have been his toe, the stories vary a bit, but broke a digit. Some of them sort of compromised by saying. Anyway, he fell and he broke his toe, his finger. He slapped the ground and he said, "I am coming, why do you call me?" and immediately killed himself by holding his breath. It's an old story, okay? Right. Maybe he had a plastic bag, I don't know. Now, we might be tempted to say, what is the big deal about a broken finger? But the point is, so the Stoics say, that Zeno interpreted his fall not as reason in itself to die, but as the sign that he had been watching for, that the gods were calling him back from his post in life. The gods were telling him his time was up, and he obeyed by committing suicide. So you see, both Socrates and Zeno, then, at least as far as we can tell, believed themselves not to be making a free and independent choice to die, but to be carrying out a divine command to do so. What differs between them is what they thought constituted a reliable message from the gods. And then, a few hundred years later, Cicero wrote about the death of Cato the Younger, who killed himself rather than endure the triumph of Julius Caesar. Now, Cicero says this: "Cato departed from life with a feeling of joy in having found a reason for death, for the God who is master within us forbids our departure without his permission. But when God himself has given a valid reason, as he did in the past to Socrates and in our day to Cato, then surely a wise man will joyfully pass forthwith from the darkness here into the light beyond." Now, here again is the argument that suicide is permissible only if the gods make the decision. It's otherwise forbidden. But notice, too, that how what constitutes a God-given valid reason has changed. From the original Socratic and Stoic claims, we've now reached a significantly expanded idea that even the anticipation of shame or hardship or punishment, which is what Cato had every reason to expect from Caesar. But even that anticipation can be construed as the God's permission to leave this life. And to this, Cicero has added the suggestion that Cato was right to rejoice because he'd been given a reason to die, as though he'd just sort of been waiting for a valid reason to come along and latched onto it as soon as he found it. We've moved from a very limited notion of when suicide may be morally permissible or even required to a significantly looser conception, the idea that even threats against one's honor or political position can give a person the out he's been looking for anyway. What seems to be developing here through all these centuries of philosophical reasoning is a conviction that it is the wise man's rational choice that makes suicide morally right. The language has continued to refer to the call of the gods, but nevertheless it is the role of human decision about what counts as God's call that comes clearly to the forefront. And with this shift in emphasis from the God's command to the wise man's decision, it's just a small step further to Seneca's claims. Now, Seneca is the first century Roman politician and essayist, is really the predominant spokesman for the further evolved view that the freedom to take one's life is the most important right available to the wise Roman citizen. That suicide is the primary assertion of human freedom, that it is the one act that undeniably labels a person as free. In Seneca's writings, there's little mention about the God's call or permission. Listen to his exaltation of suicide as freedom in this passage from his essay on anger. In any kind of servitude, the way lies open to liberty. If the soul is sick and because of its imperfections unhappy, a man may end its sorrows and at the same time himself. In whatever direction you may turn your eyes, there lies the means to end your woes. See you that precipice? Down that is the way to liberty. See you that ocean, that river, that well? There sits liberty at the bottom. See you that tree, your gullet, your heart? They are ways of escape from servitude. Are the ways of egress I show you too toilsome? Do you require too much courage and strength? Do you ask, what is the highway to liberty? Any vein in your body. Now, Seneca seems to have abandoned the classic Stoic idea that life and death are matters of indifference. In fact, he recommends suicide to pretty much everybody he corresponds with, and he commits suicide himself. Now, the poignant irony to Seneca's story is that he committed suicide because Nero ordered him to do it, and not because he had freely chosen his time to leave. But you can see why he's the dominant spokesperson for this. For Seneca, and for many of his contemporaries in the first centuries of this era, the possibility of suicide was central to their ethical thought, because suicide was the ultimate assurance that they would be able to keep their freedom, their integrity, their honor intact, no matter what. From this complex and changing ancient reasoning about suicide, there emerged general agreement on the crucial point that suicide had to be clearly a free and rational choice in order to be a morally good act. That's what was clear in all of this. It's no surprise then that committing suicide became an important confirmation that one was, in fact, a truly wise man, noble and free and rational, indifferent to the world, the most nearly approximating the perfection of a Stoic sage. And it was into this culture of noble, chosen suicide that the early Christians brought an alternative way of thinking about it. Christians agreed with the early Socratic idea that human beings belong to God and do not have the right to destroy their lives by their own volition, but they rejected the notion that God would ever compel, much less allow, a person to commit suicide. Instead of exalting human freedom and honor, Christians taught humility. Instead of counseling a well-chosen exit, Christians encourage patience and endurance in the face of life's pains and insults. So with the growth and spread of Christianity, the emphasis on free and rational choice that marked the ancient philosophical approach to the moral question of suicide began shifting, gradually but decisively, toward the Christian belief that it is precisely the fact of choice that makes suicide morally wrong, that to take the decision to die into one's own hands is to usurp God's power. Antiquity on, from Augustine to Dante and beyond, Christians, and of course, as you know, that meant pretty much everybody who was in any sort of authority in the West, Christians assumed that suicide was the worst of crimes. The more closely related the murderer was to his victim, the more serious the crime of murder, and there's no one you can be more closely related to than yourself. So murder of the self was the worst of crimes. And as often the case with such a bedrock belief, this view of suicide as the worst of acts took on powerful and peculiar forms in folklore and in the formal legal system. The person who killed himself became a particularly frightening specter for the populace. As the very lowest category of criminal, the victim of suicide was believed to have the greatest ghost potential, and that created a lot of odd behavior that seems odd to us now, I guess didn't then. But even more than vampires and witches, the suicide victim was thought to be a restless soul doomed to haunt the life he had abandoned. For example, as a consequence of the fear surrounding the bodies of suicide victims, those that went unclaimed became the first sort of natural subjects for anatomical dissection, once that was allowed at all, because it was thought that they deserved no better, but it was also thought that cutting them up into pieces might effectively immobilize their ghosts. No statistics on whether it worked. In England, and probably true of much of the rest of Europe, persons who attempted suicide, this is in the Middle Ages, and later, persons who attempted suicide but were unsuccessful were hanged. As church lady would say, isn't that convenient? Their bodies and the bodies of successful suicides had to be buried in very specifically prescribed ways. They had stones placed on their faces, stakes driven through their hearts, and then they were buried at the intersection of two roads. And that was because it was hoped that the traffic on the roads would keep the ghost in the grave, or if that were unsuccessful and the ghost managed to escape anyway, that the number of roads would confuse the ghost and he wouldn't be able to find his way back to his old haunts. There was also the notion that the cross formed by the road would exert some magical power and sort of diminish the evil energy of the ghost. The last suicide victim to be buried that way in England died in 1823. So not really the Middle Ages. Now, if the suicide victim were a person of title and property, the entire estate was forfeited to the government. The family members of the suicide victim could inherit nothing because the Suicides Act marked him as a non-person with no rights to hold or to pass on possessions or titles. And it was the distress related to this loss of property and standing that seems to have played a major role in another reversal of ideas about suicide as a choice. Families of wealthy suicide victims started petitioning sympathetic courts to declare that the dead person was not in his right mind when he killed himself. Because if he were declared to have been insane at the time of death, then his property and titles would not be forfeited. Now, this development seems almost inevitable, at least from this vantage point in time, as an economically and socially driven consequence of the Christian idea that suicide has to be condemned because it is a rational choice, a choice to play God by ending one's life. If it can be shown that it was not reasonably chosen, but was done in an irrational or delusional state, then the burden of condemnation with all its attendant social and spiritual consequences could be avoided. Now, this reasoning generally worked only with those who succeeded at their suicide attempts and so were no longer around to give the lie to the diagnosis of insanity. As one author has said, someone who attempted suicide was a criminal if he did not succeed and a lunatic if he did. Now, it wasn't long, as you might imagine, before the public apparently began to think that perhaps the mere fact of suicide was sufficient evidence of insanity, that no one in his right mind would kill himself, so suicide cannot be a matter of rational choice. It must be a symptom or a result of a disorder for which one could not be held responsible. So as we know, historically, anathema and criminalization began to give way to compassion and therapy. And by the late 19th century, the sociologist Emil Durkheim had famously described suicide as the result of unbearable social pressures, further diffusing the moral responsibility for the death of the suicide victim. This is all very far away from the ancient Greek and Roman view that suicide could escape condemnation only if it is rationally chosen. Now, suicide could escape condemnation only if it were not a free and rational choice. Now, given this history of changes in thinking about how the rightness or wrongness of suicide is related to whether it's freely and rationally chosen or not, it may not be so surprising that the notion of physician-assisted suicide is alarming to some people. A basic premise of most ethical discussions of assisted suicide is that if it is to be morally right at all, if it is not to be murder, then it has to be a free and rational choice made by the person who's choosing to die. But after centuries of working our collective way around to accepting suicide only if it's not a free and rational choice of a sane person, after millennia of being taught to value steadfast endurance above a well-timed exit, we do not, I think, so easily or happily shift back towards Seneca's insistence that nothing marks the nobility and freedom of human life so clearly as the capacity to leave at the time and by the method of one's own choosing. The view of suicide as a rational choice that is held by many supporters of assisted suicide for the terminally ill would not be alien to ancient Greeks and Romans. Consider as just one example Derek Humphreys' best-selling book of 1991, Final Exit. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that book. It's a good read. You remember, if you know anything about it, that it teaches dying patients who wish to end their suffering the most certain and least messy ways of committing suicide. So just as Seneca pointed out cliffs to fall from and rivers to drown in and veins to open, Humphrey recommends plastic bags to pull over your head and the right sort and quantity of pills to stash away for the day of decision. Now, some who suffer from relentlessly painful illnesses may believe, as Zeno did, that they can hear in the circumstances of their lives and their illnesses the call from God to come home, to leave their post, God's permission to end the life that they believe does belong to God. And moreover, many people believe and draw comfort from the idea that death can be a form of healing when no other healing is possible, and from there it's but a short step further to view death as a healing that God provides and allows the sufferer to choose. So like Socrates and Zeno, then, a sufferer could see the choice of suicide to be rational and even compelled, justifiable, not because the actor is not in his or her right mind, but precisely because that mind is still capable of reading signs from God or the gods and obeying. But however, such personal experiences and convictions aside, we are still left with the ethical question that inevitably arises from this history of human thought about suicide. If suicide is freely, rationally chosen, does that characteristic make it justifiable, as Seneca would say, as some modern supporters of assisted suicide would say? Does that characteristic make it a sin or a crime, as theologians and jurists for 2,000 years of Western history have claimed? To muddy the waters further, somebody once said that a good philosophy lecture leaves you with more questions than you started out with. This is going to be a good philosophy lecture. To muddy the waters further, is it possible to know whether a particular suicide is chosen in the requisite sense? To what extent can a despairing teenager or a despairing, pain-racked, dying patient be said to choose suicide freely, even if rationally? To what extent might the act instead feel compelled, inevitable, necessary? For that matter, what do we think about the choice of a committed social activist to set himself afire in a public place to protest social injustices, as some Buddhist monks did in Vietnam, as members of Falun Gong did more recently in Tiananmen Square? Even in times when condemnation of suicide has been most absolute, people have generally not condemned and have been more likely to praise the person who chooses to die rather than give up a principle, to die rather than betray his country, to die rather than deny the faith. But if it's all right, if it's even good to choose to die for a principle, is it all right to choose to kill oneself for a principle? That is, if suicide is chosen, does the reason behind that free and rational choice make a difference to our moral judgment of it? So let me shift the focus now a bit from the issue of whether suicide should be understood as a choice to the question of what's being chosen when the decision is made to die by one's own hand. There are countless possible answers, most of them, I think, incorrigibly superficial, to the question of what's being chosen by the decision to commit suicide. Killing oneself may be the decision to put an end to physical pain or emotional distress or intolerable disgrace. It may be a statement of social protest or an attempt to influence a political situation. It may be an attempt to, a refusal rather, to betray a principle or a friend or a country. All of these possibilities have to do with this life, ending its misery, influencing it, supporting or someone or some ideal in it. Does anyone commit suicide for the sake of a future life? We are told that some Islamic terrorists, like some Islamic warriors before them, may seek death not only for political effect, but also to gain immediate entry into paradise. But on the other hand, it was the Jesuit priest Hopkins, whose lines of poetry I read earlier, who described suicide as the choice not to be. Even he, thoroughly committed believer in the afterlife that he was, thought in terms of ending the present, not of beginning a longed-for heavenly future. What is being chosen by those who choose death? You may remember how Hamlet debates this question in a soliloquy that is so well known that it's easy to miss the clues it gives to the sorts of confusions that haunt us about the aftermath of suicide. So listen to it again. I'm going to intersperse it with some of my glosses. You know it. To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, that is, to do what theologians have recommended since the earliest centuries, to express one's human dignity and trust by enduring faithfully whatever life brings, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. That is, to do what the classic pagan authors that Hamlet supposedly had read, if he were a real person, what they recommended, which was to express one's human dignity and freedom by refusing to bear such outrageous fortune, to instead walk away from it into death, to die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. Death as the choice not to be, as a decision to end one's natural vulnerability to slings and arrows and aches and shocks by simply eliminating one's vulnerable flesh. What a relief that would be. But what if death is not really an end to being? To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. There's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. So if death is like sleep, and sleep can be full of dreams, maybe the choice to die is not the choice not to be. Maybe consciousness persists and there is something beyond this life, this mortal coil. What else could explain the willingness of so many people to go on despite outrageous fortune? For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay? And here Hamlet goes on this long list of the various possible manifestations of outrageous fortune, asking finally, who would grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to other that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. So if suicide's not really choosing not to be, if being really does continue after death, then what might that undiscovered country be? And is that really what I want to choose in choosing death? Maybe I better think again. See, Hamlet's bipolar question has expanded to include a third possibility, to be or not to be, or to be something else, unknown and fearful. The ancient Greeks and Romans, to go back to them for a moment, had little idea of an afterlife. Their goal of the vita beata, the blessed life, was very much a this-world concept. They gave plenty of philosophical theories about the immortality of the soul and about reincarnation, but little description of or an argument for a recognizably human existence after death. So when Cicero, speaking of Cato's death, said that a wise man will joyfully leave the darkness here and go to the light beyond, it's not at all clear what he meant by the light beyond, nor in what sense the wise, now dead, Cato would be aware of, much less enjoy, that light. Clearly, there was also no fear that suicide would prevent Cato from seeing that light, but this kind of rhetoric aside, it's probably safe to say that when ancient thinkers spoke of suicide as the end of one's life, that's what they meant, that it was the choice not to be. So again, with Christianity came another idea, the notion of a significantly better place to go after life. And with that idea came a very different and problematic notion of what one chooses in choosing death. See, the paradox engendered by the idea of heaven, an idyllic afterlife, is that there's now a serious reason to want to die. Not in order not to be, but instead in order to be in paradise with God. Now, the church eventually said unequivocally that because killing oneself is such a terrible crime and eliminates any chance for repentance, that suicide will keep you out of heaven forever, so don't even think about it. But let me explain that word eventually. While Christian doctrine and moral theology were still in their earliest formative stages, the Christian understanding of the relation of suicide to paradise was considerably complicated by the phenomenon of martyrdom. The willingness of some believers to undergo, even to seek out persecution and go eagerly to their deaths, caused many non-Christian observers to be suicidal. Some officials of the Roman Empire who were charged with carrying out executions of Christians who refused to follow the empire's required religious rituals sometimes reacted with disgust to what they considered to be Christians using them to carry out their own death wishes. Here's one example found in the writings of Tertullian, the 2nd century Christian apologist. He writes this: when Arius Antoninus was carrying out a vehement persecution in Asia, all the Christians of the city appeared in a body before his tribunal. As they just sort of showed up voluntarily, they said, "We're Christians, we're not going to sacrifice to your God, so you're going to have to kill us." Okay? After ordering a few to be led away to execution, Arius said to the rest, "Wretched men, if you wish to die, you have precipices and ropes to hang yourselves." I suspect Arius knew his Seneca, and he regarded with some contempt these men who asked him to take responsibility for their deaths. But now, throughout the period of the persecutions, Christians wrestled with complex moral questions about how to behave in the face of the threat. Should I run away? Is that the equivalent of betraying the faith? Should I stay and take my chances? Is that being too careless with my God-given life? Should I welcome martyrdom as the sign that I've been found worthy to suffer for the faith and I'll definitely go to heaven? Should I even actively seek out a martyr's death, which will make me worthy of paradise, no matter how bad my life has been? In the early literature of Christianity, you can find impassioned arguments on all sides of these questions. Bishops and theologians trying very hard to second-guess God, with very little help from Scripture, which doesn't have much to say on this subject. Where is the line between gladly suffering for God and courting death in order to claim heaven? Well, there are no reports from that time of anyone who killed himself because the persecutors passed him by, but there are plenty of stories of martyrs who jumped into the flames or lured the animals on to get them, called to the lions. And here, for example, is Ignatius, first-century bishop, who prayed for the opportunity to die as a martyr. May I enjoy the wild beasts that are prepared for me, and I pray that they may be found eager to rush upon me, which also I will entice to devour me speedily. Let fire and the cross, let the crowds of wild beasts, let breakings, tearings, and separations of bones, let cutting off of members, let bruising to pieces of the whole body come upon me. You can perhaps understand why Christians were thought to be madly suicidal, and why, given such enthusiastic bishops, it took the church a few centuries to figure out what it had to say about suicide. Now, one of the interesting aspects of these questions surrounding martyrdom and suicide is that early Christian writers tended to specifically praise women who chose death over loss of their virginity or chastity. Now, some of these women just allowed themselves to be killed, but most of those we know about killed themselves. They jumped off roofs, they went in groups into deep rivers and drowned themselves to avoid being raped by the persecutors. And many writers of the time who otherwise sharply condemned suicide praised these women who actively chose to take their bodies undefiled into death. And it was this apparent exception to Christian arguments against suicide that ultimately led Augustine to weigh in early in the 5th century. Augustine argued that the threat of losing one's virginity cannot justify killing oneself because chastity is a spiritual state, not a physical one. Isn't that interesting? And as long as the victim of a rape does not participate in the lust, she has committed no sin. Now, you notice, of course, that this particular part of Augustine's reasoning got lost pretty quickly and has yet to be fully reclaimed by the church or by the society it has influenced. But Augustine says she commits no sin by being raped. Killing herself, on the other hand, is a grave sin from which there can be no spiritual recovery. And it's his absolute condemnation of suicide, allowing for no exceptions, that became the unquestioned doctrine of the church. So suicide thus became not the ambiguous choice not to be, but the unambiguous decision to be damned for eternity. And centuries later, this understanding of the choice would be demonstrated graphically in Dante's placement of those who die by their own hands within his imagined circles of hell in the Divine Comedy, which he wrote around the year 1300. As I expect you know, in the section of the book that's titled The Inferno, Dante presents a vision of hell as 9 concentric circles descending towards an icy Satan who is fixed at the center of the frozen lake that is at the deepest pit of hell. The worst sinners are in the circles closest to Satan. If you start at the first outermost circle, that's limbo, that's unbaptized babies and virtuous pagans like Plato. And then the third circle has gluttons, and the 6th circle has heretics. Things are getting worse as you go towards the center. And the 7th circle of the 9 is the destiny of those who were violent in this life. The outer ring of that 7th circle holds those who made war and murdered strangers. So highwaymen are there, and so are Alexander the Great and Attila the Hun. And then the middle ring of the seventh circle is reserved for those who are violent against themselves, persons who committed suicide. So they're worse than those who murder strangers, worse than Attila the Hun, but not quite so bad as blasphemers who are in the inner ring of the seventh circle. And they're not as bad as folks in the eighth circle who are thieves and alchemists and hypocrites and fortune tellers. And not nearly so bad as you can imagine as the folks in the ninth and last circle who are the ones who betrayed kin or country or masters. Both Judas and Brutus are frozen right at the center of hell, right next to Satan. But even being back in the seventh circle is no picnic, it's still hell. In Dante's vision, those who killed themselves are doomed to exist for eternity as stunted, misshapen trees whose branches and leaves are continually being ripped away by harpies, these big vicious birds. The wounds caused by the harpies cause the trees to bleed, but it's also only through those wounds that the damned souls can speak. See, in the logic of Dante's hell, because the ultimate expression of their earthly lives was self-destruction, victims of suicide can now only express themselves through that which also destroys them. Well, eventually they, like all the other tortured souls, will retrieve their earthly bodies at the final judgment, but alone of all the inhabitants of hell, the persons who committed suicide will not be allowed to re-inhabit their bodies. Here's how one lost soul explains it to Dante. Like the rest, we shall go for our husks on judgment day, but not that we may wear them, for it is not just that a man be given what he throws away. Here we shall drag them, and in this mournful glade our bodies will dangle to the end of time, each on the thorn of its tormented shade. Now, this vision of eternal torture damnation has nothing in common with ancient assumptions about simply ending a life that has become burdensome. Has nothing to do with the idea that one can choose not to be, and explains a lot about the bad dreams that Hamlet fears. The Middle Ages really had little question about the meaning of suicide. But then that rich combination of humanism and theological reformation and renewed attention to ancient philosophy that marked the end of the Middle Ages initiated an almost imperceptibly gradual softening of this absolute condemnation of suicide. I spoke earlier about the gradual shift in the social and legal consensus, the shift toward regarding suicide as something other than a rational choice, and therefore something that could not always be condemned as a freely chosen sin or crime. Well, along with that change, the absolute belief that those who killed themselves were irrevocably damned also began slowly giving way, in some quarters, towards a theological stance that tends to resist presuming infallible knowledge of either the minds of other people or the judgments of God. Listen, for example, to Karl Barth, the German Protestant theologian writing in the first half of the 20th century. To be sure, it is a terrible thought that rebellion against God should have the content of an irrevocably final act. But what right have we to isolate the last moment of human existence from that which precedes, and to judge a man by this moment alone? We even have to ask whether we are authorized to judge a last act which has this content to be rebellion against God, and therefore whether every case of self-destruction is really suicide in the sense of self-murder. Even the most confirmed theological moralist ought to remember that perhaps he does not finally know what takes place between God and the suicide, nor therefore what is the decision that drives him to this dubious act. It is a long and complicated path, from ancient Roman practices of suicide down to the seventh circle of hell and back up to this more recent acknowledgement of incorrigible ambiguity. But then where are we now, after 3,000 years of thinking about what suicide means for us, morally and theologically and socially? Well, I've already claimed that there is little one can say about what suicide may have meant to a despairing teenager who hanged himself, or, for that matter, for a terminally ill person in unrelenting pain who has ended that suffering with a handful of pills in a plastic bag. Some of us may make sense of such an act and perhaps calm our distress by claiming that at least this person had the strength of character to take the powerful, free step of leaving this life in terms of her own choosing. While others of us may find meaning by asserting that he could not have been in his right mind, that he must instead have been the victim of significant emotional turmoil or vitiating depression, inadequate care and support, and therefore cannot be held accountable for the decision to die by his own hand. But either way, however we respond, we shall have to come to grips with whether we, coming at this particular point in such a long line of those who have tossed this question back and forth, whether we think that choosing freely and rationally to commit suicide makes the act morally better or morally worse, more acceptable or less. Some of us may find our grief for the person who has committed suicide exacerbated by fear that the act itself has condemned her to eternity in hell, while others of us may assuage our grief by holding to the belief that God sees more than we can and that, as Barth suggests, won't judge a person finally on the basis of a single action, no matter what it is. And still others of us may have to deal only with the grief of the loss because we believe that death is the end of being and questions of eternity are just not at issue. But either way, however we respond, we shall at some point have to come to grips with the question of what death entails for the person who has killed himself. And thus we shall have to face up to how our imaginings of that future of nothingness or bliss or torment colors not only our emotional reaction to suicide, but our moral judgments of the rightness or wrongness of the act. Whether we're responding to the possibility of legalizing physician-assisted suicide as physicians who may be called upon to assist, or as potential patients who at some point may want assistance, or as deeply concerned observers of this phenomenon, our responses may be more clearly understood, may be more clearly challenged and justified within this context of what we think about choice and what we think about destiny. Whatever stance we each feel compelled to take, I would hope that this kind of exploration would provide not only tools for thinking about the abstract question of suicide, but also give us a way to approach what's really the more difficult problem, which is actual suicide. The person we know who's done it, whom we fear may do it, whom we fear may ask us to help him do it. Being able to look at the phenomenon of suicide from these fluctuating attitudes toward rational choice and our puzzles about what choosing death means may help us as we try to respond to those who are contemplating suicide for themselves or dealing with the aftermath of the suicide of someone that they loved. Because even if we can't fathom the choice or accept it, even if we can't grasp an imagined future of non-being or believe in it, we may still be able to come to some understanding of, some active compassion for those among us who continue to ask themselves Hamlet's question. I'd be delighted to take your questions. Yes.